A child walks into kindergarten with a long, low skull, a broad chest, and a face no teacher has seen before. Genetically, this child is a Neanderthal. Could they learn our language, make friends, and grow up in our world? Fossils can tell us about bones, teeth, hearing, and ancestry. They cannot run this experiment, and they cannot predict one child's personality. That limit is the first important answer. A Neanderthal child would differ physically from a Homo sapiens child, but there is no sound evidence that they would permanently fail at friendship, school, or speech. With modern care, they might thrive. The honest mystery is not where they would inevitably break. It is which differences biology would preserve after an upbringing unlike anything their ancestors experienced. To investigate that, we have to keep three categories separate: what the remains show, what scientists reasonably infer, and what no fossil can reveal. Start with the organ that invites the biggest mistakes. Adult Neanderthal brain cases were often as large as, and on average, perhaps larger than, those of recent humans. That does not make them smarter, and it does not make us smarter either. Brain case volume is not an intelligence score. Their skulls were generally longer and lower, while ours are more globular. In 2010, Philip Gunz and colleagues compared fossil endocasts, impressions of the brain case's inner surface, and argued that the modern human skull undergoes a distinctive rounding phase during the first year after birth. Neanderthal development followed a different shape trajectory. Here is the boundary. An endocast records the outer form of a brain, not its microscopic wiring, thoughts, or classroom behavior. Researchers have proposed links between this developmental difference and cognition, but a scan cannot tell us whether this child would understand a joke, remember names, or navigate a playground. Different development is evidence. A permanent social disability is speculation. The famous vision claim needs the same break. In 2013, Eilund Pierce, Chris Stringer, and Robin Dunbar estimated that Neanderthals devoted more neural tissue to vision and controlling larger bodies, leaving less for other functions. They then modeled smaller social networks. It is an ingenious hypothesis built from orbit size, body size, and comparative assumptions. It is not a preserved map of a Neanderthal cortex. Even if average Neanderthal groups were smaller, group size can reflect ecology, population density, mobility, and mortality, as well as mental capacity. Archaeology gives the child a fairer hearing. Neanderthals coordinated dangerous hunts, manufactured multi-step tools and birch tar adhesives, transported materials, used pigments, and repeatedly cared for injured group members. None of that proves they thought exactly as we do. It does show that their lives demanded learning, cooperation, and social knowledge. So the child might process some tasks differently, but the claim that 100 classmates would overwhelm them forever goes far beyond the bones. Now listen before deciding whether this child could speak. The Kebara II skeleton from Israel, discovered in 1983, preserved a rare Neanderthal hyoid, the small throat bone that supports the tongue. Its modern human-like shape was published in 1989. A later biomechanical study found its internal structure and loading behavior compatible with speech. Neanderthals also carried the two derived amino acid changes in FOXP2 that living humans carry. FOXP2 contributes to neural circuits involved in speech and movement, but it is not a language switch. In 2021, Mercedes Conde Valverde and colleagues reconstructed Neanderthal outer and middle ears and estimated a hearing range broadly suited to spoken communication. These clues converge on speech capacity, not a transcript. Vocabulary, grammar, teaching, and conversation do not fossilize. The defensible forecast is that a Neanderthal infant immersed in a language-rich home might acquire spoken or signed language. Whether development would differ in timing, fluency, or structure remains unknown. Predicting blunt speech or a lifelong delay would only disguise imagination as diagnosis. The skeleton changes the thought experiment more clearly than the brain case does. Neanderthals typically had broad trunks, robust bones, and relatively short lower arms and legs. Those proportions are often interpreted partly as adaptations that conserved heat in Ice Age Eurasia, although ancestry and demanding activity also shaped their bodies. A modern raised child would still inherit a Neanderthal growth pattern, but not an Ice Age workout. Thick fossil shafts and pronounced muscle markings record both biology and lives spent walking, climbing, carrying, and hunting. They do not provide a middle school grip strength result. Researchers cannot responsibly promise that this child would outlift adults, and endurance is especially hard to infer from skeletons. Dental growth studies suggest subtle developmental differences, with some Neanderthal teeth maturing faster than those of recent humans, while both lineages had extended childhoods compared with earlier hominins. In a pediatric clinic, doctors would therefore measure, rather than assume, growth, joints, breathing, temperature regulation, and nutrition would all require new reference charts. Different anatomy could bring advantages, costs, or neither in any particular setting. Dinner produces another reversal. Nitrogen isotopes in the collagen of many European Neanderthals place much of their dietary protein high in the food web, consistent with substantial consumption of large herbivores. But isotopes do not print a complete menu, and they do not prescribe what a Neanderthal child must eat. Dental calculus, the mineralized plaque on teeth, has preserved starch granules and other plant remains. At sites from the Mediterranean to northern Europe, evidence points to flexible use of plants, animals, and local resources. A body raised today would not require enormous slabs of meat simply because some ancient adults hunted reindeer. Its needs would have to be discovered through growth and metabolic testing. Milk is less exotic than it sounds, too. Human infants normally produce lactase to digest breast milk. Lactase persistence means keeping high enzyme activity after childhood, and that trait became common only in some later herding populations. A Neanderthal child might lose much of that activity after weaning, but so do most living humans worldwide. That is not a unique Neanderthal failure, and low-lactose foods or ordinary dietary alternatives could address it. The classroom germ claim sounds dramatic, because time travel really would create medical uncertainty. Neanderthals lived before many pathogens associated with dense cities, livestock, and modern global travel. Yet we cannot calculate this child's response to influenza, measles, or a common cold from a fossil genome alone. Immune defense is not one shield that either exists or does not. It combines inherited variants, previous exposure, vaccination, age, nutrition, and chance. In fact, some Neanderthal-derived variants in living people affect innate immune responses, and several appear to have been favored after interbreeding. Other archaic variants can raise risks in modern environments. That history shows adaptation and trade-offs, not that Neanderthals were immunologically naked. A resurrected child might lack prior immunity to particular infections, just as any isolated population can be vulnerable to unfamiliar disease. Modern vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and monitoring would also transform the risk. Saying school germs would certainly hit harder is unsupported. The responsible answer is close medical observation, not a forecast of catastrophe. The deepest unknown is the one a school report cannot grade. Genes would come from Neanderthal parents, but development would unfold inside a sapiens family: language, diet, and culture. Human brains of every population are shaped by years of interaction. No ancient genome lets us separate inherited differences from an Ice Age childhood that can never be recreated. Even the category itself has blurred edges. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred, and many people living outside Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. This child would not be a monster, a failed modern human, or a museum specimen. They would be a person with an unprecedented biology and the same need for attachment, protection, education, and consent as any other child. Some accommodations might be substantial. Some celebrated differences might never appear. The experiment would teach us at least as much about the power of upbringing as about Neanderthal genes. Return to that kindergarten doorway. The broad-bodied child steps inside, but the confident predictions stay outside. We cannot promise extraordinary strength, perfect cold tolerance, restricted intelligence, meat dependence, dairy sickness, or collapse under modern germs. Fossils support a different anatomy, a distinctive history of brain case growth, probable speech-related capacities, flexible diet, and a complex immune inheritance. Archaeology supports people who learned, planned, cooperated, and survived, demanding worlds for hundreds of thousands of years. Everything beyond that must be tested, not declared. Could a Neanderthal child thrive today? Possibly, especially with modern medicine and a patient community. But no evidence can guarantee the outcome. The strongest conclusion is also the most humane. this child would not arrive already defeated by our world. They would walk through the same doorway as every other child, carrying traits we could measure and a future no skull could have written in advance.